Thanks, Chelsea. Welcome, everyone. So we are recording, so even if folks were in and out, hopefully you can catch the session later. I will try to go expeditiously in the interest of time. I know that we're all running behind. But hi, everyone. My name is Schmidt Olabisi. I'm associate professor at Michigan State University, and I'm one of the investigators on the Flint Leverage Point project, and joining my colleagues here working on the project with me, who will introduce themselves as they start to speak. They're also listed on the screen. So Renee Wallace and I are going to start off by giving kind of an overview of the project and some of the lessons we've learned from doing a community-engaged food systems project in a city with a very unique history like Flint. So my guess is that most of you have heard the story of Flint. It made international news. But just to recap briefly and put it in the context of the food system, in 2014, the Flint was under the management of an emergency manager who was appointed by the governor, not a democratically elected mayor. And this person made the decision to switch the water source for Flint from the Detroit public water source to the Flint River, ostensibly to save money. When that was done, appropriate anti-corrosion controls were not added to the water supply, and so the corrosive water of the Flint River ended up stripping lead out of the pipes that connected the city water supply to houses. And as a result, thousands of families, including thousands of children, were exposed to lead and suffered the consequences of that. And that's the body is heavy metal. So what's next? Food. Well, one of the ways to mitigate the impacts of lead, particularly for children as they grow, is to make sure that they have access to a healthy and nutritious diet. And this helps the lead kind of stay locked in their bones and not circulate in their bloodstream and affect their brain negatively. Unfortunately, though, we know that Flint is a city suffering under food apartheid, and so there are many families in the city of Flint that don't have access to healthy and nutritious foods in a place that they can easily get to. Depending on how you look at it, there are very few places to buy groceries within the city of Flint. Typically, you have to go outside. We'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. So we, researchers at Michigan State, working with community partners at the Community Foundation for Greater Flint, developed the idea for a project to look at how the food system in Flint could be, how we could look at leverage points to change the system to a more equitable, more sustainable, and healthier outcome for Flint residents. Go ahead, Chelsea, you can go to the next slide. Oh, this is kind of slow. So our project takes the framework of a participatory modeling, and other presenters will talk a little bit more about that and some of the specific methods we've used, which I won't get into. But I will just say that participatory modeling is building a model of a system together with people who are experts in the system, who live in it, who work in it, who encounter it on a daily basis. And so this would be, the residents of Flint. And there are many reasons to do this, one being that building a model helps us to, and a model just a representation of the system that we can have, on paper, on the computer, interact around, analyze. And that helps us to understand how the system has gotten where it's been, where the system is going in the future, what are the things that are driving that change, right? And then doing this in a participatory way also helps us kind of build consensus among stakeholders around what direction they might want to go. So in this case, the residents of Flint, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. What values do they hold and how we can shift the food system towards fulfilling those values. Go ahead, Chelsea, you can advance. And so this project involves a lot of people, and it was designed to, really engage both the kind of academic side and the community side from the beginning. So here on the screen, we have the community side kind of in the pink there, and the university side more in the blue. And the leadership team is really comprised of both. So we have kind of a core leadership team for the project, and we have folks from academia and from communities sitting on that. And then we have on the community side, we have a community consultative panel that's comprised of 12 kind of Flint food system experts that's giving us advice regularly on the project. We have a local team. It's kind of the local members of the leadership team that's advising us on the project and how it fits in with activities in the city of Flint. And then Renee is kind of in a very unique position, which she'll talk about in a minute, as the process monitor. And she's kind of advising us on the process of engaging with community. Then on the research side, we have an evaluation team, and I'll mention that in just a minute and talk a little bit more about their role. And then we have sub-teams for each of the kind of modeling techniques. And then we're also interfacing with other research teams in other cities that are funded under the same overall grant. And actually the Austin team presenting at this food systems conference is one of those teams. So we're interfacing with them as well. Okay, go ahead, Chelsea. Okay, and I'll just briefly wrap up my piece before turning it over to Renee by talking about a couple of things that we've learned by doing this work. And why am I telling you this? Well, I'm telling you this because I'm hoping that there will be more projects like this in the future. I think it's been a really amazing learning experience, and we need more kind of food systems work, I think, that uses some of these tools. So one of the things that we learned doing this project is, this is going to sound elementary, but the importance of communication. And, you saw that slide with all of the moving parts and all the different people involved in it. And we really had to kind of catch our stride in the first 2 years of the project in terms of how are we going to communicate between all these moving parts and let everybody know what's going on and how they can participate and, coordinate things. And I think it took us a couple of years to hash that out. But once we did, we were then able to kind of ride out the pandemic, still having that great communication.
Laura, you're breaking up pretty badly. I can't hear you right now.
Huh. Okay.
Is Laura there?
So perhaps I could jump in while she's coming back.
That's perfect.
Yeah, so as Laura was sharing, we have a very diverse team, and we have a lot of coverage. Doing projects of this nature requires people in a variety of roles, and the thing that really holds teams like this together are grounded in relationships. We had some pre-existing relationships before the project started. So some of us had done conferences about food, about modeling together. Some of us had food system experience, and many of us had worked together in other aspects. So coming together was really important. Another key relationship, and this stands out for me because I serve on this project as a process monitor, but I'm also on this project as a person out of Detroit, Michigan. I lead a nonprofit called Food Plus Detroit and a consulting firm called Doing Edge. It was always about how do we do this in Flint, but also how do we do it in other cities. And so being on the team, I had a distinct opportunity to kind of see how all of these parts work together on the community side and the research side to really form an excellent partnership. So having really strong leadership on both sides. So in our case, the initiator or the instigator was a woman named Artina Sadler. And there are many people, when you talk to them about this project, they will tell you that they're here because of Artina. So never underestimate the power of the convener, that person who said, yes, we need to do this. She was the food systems navigator who kind of brought this idea to the foundation and had relationships with many of the people on the research team. So that's how we were able to really sharpen our design out the gate with having participation of key folks on the community side, the leadership team, with folks who can look at things early on to help inform decisions and how things worked. So it became, we talk about it being participatory. That was one of the things that made it more participatory, so that we also served as a bridge too with the community consultative panel. So as the process monitor, and I do process work for a living, I hang out in the white space. You get to hang around and look at opportunities to integrate work. And so doing that really helped to strengthen our communications and to connect the dots. So we have very innovative design, but a lot of it was emergent. So we designed things up front. We had things in our proposal, but it was also iterative, meaning that there were things that would go back and forth between the different research methodologies, but it also was very emergent. We had to respond to what we learned as we went, and then also the fact that some of these things were being done for the very first time, and so we had to really lean into our relationships and our communication to determine how to best move forward. And so partnerships happened, but not only between community and the researchers in the academy, but also between researchers and researchers, between researchers and evaluators, between all of us. Our relationships really deepened in this process. And we are, as we're in year 4, we're still learning, and we expect to see that accelerate immensely in our last year and a half of the project. I'll give it back to Laura or Chelsea at this point. I know we're making up time here.
Thanks, Renee. Laura, do you have anything else?
I'm just going to keep my video off because I think it's causing problems. But no, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
We're still learning. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I am going to build on this previous presentation by Laura and Renee, who really gave us that great framework for what the project as a whole is looking at, and delve a little bit deeper in to one of the components of data collection that we did in this project. And in this particular part of the data collection, I'm going to talk about some work that we did in a photo elicitation project to understand household food security amongst Flint residents during the pandemic. So this provides an overview of our photo elicitation process. So basically what we did here was we asked participants who are Flint residents to take about 20 or so photos that depicted how they and their household navigated the food system in Flint. And they then also provided captions for each of those photos so that we could have some more information and context about the rationale for why they took that picture. And then they participated in an interview where we talked about the images, but also more broadly about the food system. We did all of this through Zoom or on the phone because this took place during the pandemic when we were all in lockdown. So it's another example, kind of building on what Laura and Renee talked about how we had to work with our partners and pivot to be able to support changes in the system that happened as we were going along. We also had an evaluation form that was part of all of the data collection in order to get some demographic information and also feedback about the project. And then after we had data collection there, we moved into a coding process where we looked at all of the data, the interviews, the photos, and the captions, and identified thematic codes from the perspectives of the participants. And then we moved into an analysis of those. So we looked at the themes that were presenting themselves in the material and analyzed those for their broader context and also the quantity or the frequency in which they came up in the data to understand a little bit about how important they were. I'm gonna pass it over to Livy to talk a little bit more about our participants.
Livy might not be here at the moment.
Oh, okay. Well, then I will tell you a little bit about our participants. Thanks for letting me know since I can't see you all anymore. So we had a pretty small sample, but we had really, really rich data collection. So our target audience here was really Flint residents who are non-food system experts from a diverse background. We didn't go for or aim for a representative sample of the population of Flint. That would be way too large of a data set for us to collect, but we did want to have an opportunity to talk in a lot of detail with a smaller number of people so that we could better understand how they move through the food system and why they were making the choices that they were making for their family. So the box here at the bottom ends up showing that we had 341 images along with their corresponding captions, and then over 20 hours of interview data, and all of that together became the data for this project. So while the number of participants seems small, the data set is really, really rich. And so when we talk about the effects of COVID-19 on the Flint food system, there were some things that we see consistent with what happened across the country, and then there are a number of things that that were really important to Flint specifically. And so one of the things that we saw a lot was how participants changed their shopping habits, decreasing the number of trips that they go to the number of times they go to the store and how long they're there, changing some of their shopping locations, concerns about the types of food that were available, and shortages of some foods. So people really felt like they needed to change their behavior around the food system. And I want to emphasize that food access in Flint, our results showed that was really changed. It wasn't necessarily limited overall, in part because there were so many really good interventions that happened, both within the city and at the national level. So particularly the pandemic EBT is an example of a really successful government intervention. Between that and the stimulus checks that families received, that actually gave a lot more to people to spend on their food than they might otherwise had. And it became a really, really important measure to help people maintain some food security during this crisis. And there were also increased food distribution options. So that was really important as a source of access for food as well. However, there was also a lot of emotional stress from the pandemic, and Flint residents reported fears about shopping, that getting food becomes a kind of point of transmission, and that process of getting food became pretty stressful overall. At the same time, sharing food with neighbors and friends and spending more time with your family members and building those connections became stress relieving activities. So we saw food having both those positive and negative effects on stress. So in the challenges that people reported from with accessing food during the pandemic, we saw a lot of confusion over distribution sites that seemed a bit haphazard. They weren't always in the same places or with the same locations. Residents reported being worried that there wouldn't be enough food for people, and they reported, along with our community partners, that there was a huge influx in the number of people attending food distributions. And so sometimes people talked about being hesitant to take some food because they thought their situation maybe wasn't quite bad enough, and they didn't want to take food away from people that they thought might be in a greater need. And then the pandemic also exacerbated existing problems about transportation and access to food stores that we already knew were problems in Flint before the pandemic. And so I want to give you a couple examples about what this looks like in our data. So One thing that was really important in Flint is that the pandemic really was compounded by the problems of the Flint water crisis that Laura and Renee talked about that were already happening in the background. So I'll share this quote from one of the participants with you who said, quote, "On top of just everyday life in Flint, it's a little bit more high stress anyway, but to add the pandemic, add the water crisis on top of that, and then I'm dealing with unemployment, and it's just like, you know what, I'm just trying my best not to break out into shingles because I know when I get super stressed out, I get sick," end quote. So that's really helping us to see how people are talking about the impact of the water crisis, the pandemic, and their access to food in this whole broader context of their overall health and the stress that's related to that. And that becomes really, it helps us to see things really at a much more systemic level in the ways that that food access is integrated into all these different components of people's lives. We also have this example from one of our participants about dairy prices. We had a lot of people who talked about price increases at the grocery store and took photos there. And we have this other image here in the center where a person wrote about how they were walking up to their apartment and their bag broke, and so all their food fell out of it and their eggs broke. And then they had to go back to the store during the pandemic, which is another kind of layer of stress and difficulty because people were trying to limit their access to going to the store during the pandemic for safety. But in all of that other context, you see these bottles of water, cases of water on the stairs, and get an illustration through this data to see that the range of challenges families are facing during this time, and the continued reliance on bottled water and the ongoing Flint water crisis visually depicted in these images. So it gives us some really important context. There were also a lot of silver linings to COVID, and there were a number of people who talked about things that they thought were really good or positive that came from the pandemic. And one of the things that was important here was the importance of family and community connections and the way that people worked really hard to support one another through informal networks. People reported this being a really good time for social support, connecting with their kids and grandchildren and their family members. And we had lots of people taking pictures of cooking with their kids and grandchildren and talking about that time and space being really important. Again, the pandemic EBT had a really positive impact on people's ability to purchase foods and illustrates a government success there. So when we look again in more detail at this finding, about the importance of strong community connections and family networks in Flint, it really shows the important ways that these informal networks really work together to help one another through this crisis. And these informal networks were discussed across the whole range of participants, food insecure and food secure people alike. And they help remind us that food system work is community work, and that food is an important part of sharing and showing affection and care and daily life celebrations. It's not just about getting nutrients into your body. So we have this quote here where a participant is talking about the way that people show their affection through food. They show their affection and their love through food, and that becomes really important to how people thought about navigating this system. In particular, we had lots of people who talked about picking up food at food distributions, sharing extra food that they got, picking up food for other families beyond their own, and showing how they were trying to kind of spread their resources around and make sure that their friends and neighbors were taken care of. And this highlights some of the importance that these types of networks have, because they're often overlooked when we're focused on more formal sectors of the food system. And so, again, building on what Laura and Renee shared, this is all about coming up with data that we can use for positive change and intervention. And so one of our next steps here is the integration of these different data collection methods together to inform our larger modeling efforts that are ongoing now and through the spring. And we're also working with our community consultative panel to get feedback on this process and to come up with ideas about how we can create better interventions moving forward. We've got a series of briefing notes and other things up on our website that we continue to add to throughout the process as we get more data. And that website is listed here on our on the bottom of the slide. So I encourage folks to be able to go there and check it out to be able to see some more resources as well. And now I am going to turn it over to Carissa to share your next example that we have here of our products.
Excellent. Chelsea, can you stop sharing? Yes. Okay. Hello. Can everyone hear me? Great. So I will try to go quickly. Madi will also be chatting with me, but we'll try to leave 5 minutes at the end for questions. So I'll be talking about fuzzy cognitive mapping, sort of going over what it is, why it's a useful tool for community work and participatory modeling, how we used it in Flint, and also some of our preliminary results. So very high level, fuzzy cognitive mapping is a tool and a method for understanding how people understand systems and really capture their knowledge and then put it together. But very practically, it's concepts that have connections to each other. So these are directed connections. So for this example, climate change has an impact on extreme weather. They're either positive or negative connections, which just means if one goes up, does the other one also go up? So for this case, if there's more climate change, there's more extreme weather, it's a positive connection. If it goes down, then it's negative. And then finally, the connection weight. So as number between 0 and 1, sort of estimating how influential one thing is on another, which I've represented by changing the thickness of the line. So this is kind of the starting point, and people build on new concepts and connections to each other to build out their map, their understanding of the system. And then what we're able to do is take all of these different perspectives, all of this knowledge, and combine it into what is called a collective intelligence model. But it's a bit more messy than this. What it really looks like is more something like this. You know, bodies of knowledge that overlap and disagree. And what we're getting at with the collective intelligence model is an average of this that is more complete and more broad than any one person knows. So putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. What we're also able to do with FCM is run scenarios. So we can use the network structure, all of these connections between concepts, to see what would happen if we pushed a lever. So in this case, if we pressed this concept, the positive connection would mean that that concept raises and the negative means it falls, and so on and so forth through the network, slowly losing strength. And why this is cool is that, you know, from the surface, we might say, hey, the impact of this lever is this one strong positive impact. But because we have the network, we can see that there's actually a lot of decreases that maybe we need a plan for. Instead of saying, oh, yes, it's just a win-win, we can consider the other impacts. So it's really, I'll go through this very quickly. It's easy to collect. I just explained all of it in 3 minutes. Everyone now can make a fuzzy cognitive map, and it's pretty accessible results for community partners. However, it doesn't have the sort of technological capabilities of quantitative modeling. So you can't have nonlinear relationships, you can't have temporal dynamics, and your scenario results are relative. So it's a sort of trade-off of how easy it is to explain and do with someone in one session, and really what you're able to model with the math behind it. So quickly go through FCM in Flint. So as we talked about, it's really been this very integrative process, sort of building into each other. And what we've really taken from the focus groups is the development of values. So these are things that Flint community members want from the food system, things like affordability, nutritious foods, education, quality of life, those sorts of things. And this really set the stage for our interviews. So we walk through where people get food in Flint with our participants, how those sources relate to the values, and then they kind of open it up, add in other important or influential system elements, and finally, how the system could be changed. So they start with a base map and build out from there. And we really want to get participants, and we have participants from these different sectors, but as I mentioned, often your knowledge isn't discrete. It's not simply in one. You know, you've experienced from your job, from volunteering, from community activism, your lived experience. So we ended up with people who had, you know, some really were focused in one, but many had experience across 2 or 3 or all of these sectors, which gave us a really deep and complete picture. We had 51 interviews, lots of concepts that we were able to reduce just by grouping things that were conceptually very similar or, you know, just worded slightly different, and over 2,000 connections. As I said, we had, you know, really like people who had over 10 years of experience, 82% were Flint residents. So these are people who are very deeply connected and have a lot of expertise that they were able to share with us. I'll now turn it over to Madi.
Thank you, Carissa. But before we go through the collective intelligence model, let's see how diverse are the FCMs among different groups of expertise or in individual levels. So we use 2 different ways of evaluating. The first one is cause-effect relationships, and the other is cognitive color spectrum that I will explain more. Next slide, please. So the first one is simply just select one component from the system and see the influencing factors that have been mentioned by different groups. For example, which factors affect affordability in Flint food systems. So based on different FCMs that we have, we can just have a long list of different influencing factors and their frequency that have been mentioned by different groups. You can see there are different influencing factors among different groups of expertise, but if you look at the top frequent and repeated ones, you can see that, for example, convenience stores, farmers market, or use of supplemental have been mentioned by different groups too. Next slide, please. Thank you. So although we can just have a very detailed information about the influencing factors for each groups of expertise, and also wide range of, you know, different factors if we want to just work on a specific component, but it's unable to capture the mediation effect, and also it cannot provide a holistic or picture of the whole system. So we will use another way called cognitive color spectrum. First, we need to just define some categories based on the components that have a similar concept. Here we came up with 25 different subcategories, and then we need to calculate the centrality for each subcategories. The higher centrality means that people have mentioned more relationship for this subcategory to another subcategories. The left side picture shows how different people have covered different subcategories in their maps. But if we want to have a better insight about their fuzzy cognitive maps, we can use the normalized cognitive color spectrum. and easily we can see what are the dominant concepts in their fuzzy cognitive maps. Here we can see a lot of people have mentioned or have put a considerable amount of emphasis on distribution and retail activities, food security outcomes, and well-being outcomes. But we can also do it for groups of expertise, so we can just compare different groups based on their cognitive color spectrums. If you look at, for example, the production groups, you can see more purple color. It means that they have mentioned more relationship for production activity. Or, for example, people from supplemental groups have put more emphasis on Flint community schools. So as you can see here, we can easily visualize and compare different groups based on their fuzzy cognitive maps. And also it gives us a very good opportunity to see what are the dominance concepts in their fuzzy cognitive maps. Can you please go to the next slide, please? Oh, yes. But we are still unable to capture a cause-effect relationships directly, and also it's highly dependent on researchers' categorization process. So we need to be very careful about the categorization process. And now we can see how we can use these diverse thoughts and fuzzy cognitive maps to build a collective intelligence model. Thank you.
Great. So I'll do this very quickly. This is the model that we created. You can see the base map reflected in the different colored sectors and the yellow values. And our future directions is really using this to evaluate possible leverage points. So one example might be a community-owned cooperative grocery store that has an impact by lowering grocery store closures, increasing income and employment, and strengthening the local food economy. And if we run a scenario, we can see all of the positive outcomes of more nutritious foods, more quality of life, affordability, equity, and justice. So that's really where we're going, getting feedback from the community on the model to make sure it's accurate to people's experiences, evaluating these leverage points. And then really the last step is engaging with our partners and other actors with the results to really pull the levers and hopefully work towards positive change in Flint.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks for everyone's patience as we had lots of technical difficulties at the beginning here and moved through that really quickly. But if there are any questions in our last 3 minutes, we don't see any in the Q&A. Don't know all who is here, but I wanted to leave that open now for some questions. I think we might actually get kicked out of this room in 3 minutes, but
we started late, people may not get it in real time. I think it will be recorded and shared, right? Maybe we can leave contact.
Laura, sorry, I can't understand what you're saying because it's really broken up. Can you try again?
Can you hear me now?
A little bit, yeah.
Is that better?
That's better.
A little bit. Okay. All right. I guess I can't share my video with this. That we leave contact information. Might be watching this recording later, and then maybe they can contact the question.
Yeah, I think I got the gist. Is that we want to leave our contact information so that in the recording that people can contact us and make sure that we can follow up with questions and stuff there, since we didn't have time to do that much here, especially if people weren't able to attend but then saw the recording later. So I think if people look in the Q&A section, I will type in my email and I can share questions with anybody to that email, and I'll also type in our project website, which is where you can access all of the data that that we have available to share so far is up there. We have overview and information about that, and there's also lots of points in which you can reach out and contact us through the website. We're all listed in the about pages with our emails there, as well as you can contact the project more generally through the website too. So hopefully people will have a chance to look at that as a point of connection and interaction. The community and academic resources page within the website is where you'll find most of our dissemination products. So hopefully people can check that out. And thanks everyone for listening and participating. We will head to the main stage for closing remarks now. I'm getting an announcement about that. Thanks.